Welcome to Public Health on Call, a new podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Josh Sharfstein, a faculty member at Johns Hopkins and also a former health commissioner in Baltimore City. Until now, our sole focus has been COVID-19. We are broadening the podcast to other urgent public health issues, beginning with racism, police violence, and the national protests over the homicide of George Floyd. In this episode, I speak with Professor Echo Yanka of Yeshiva University. Professor Yanka is a law professor and philosopher who studies the intersection between political philosophy and the criminal justice system. Let's listen. Professor Yanka, thank you so much for joining me. You are a law professor and a philosopher, and you think and write about the criminal justice system, including the legitimacy of the police. And I think it is obvious to look at the protests that are going on in the United States and around the world that the legitimacy of the police is very much being questioned. And I guess I want to start with a question for you, which is, where does the legitimacy of the police come from? And, what do we mean when we say it's being questioned?
First of all, thank you for having me. Political philosophers spend a lot of time arguing about what legitimacy means and what it would look like. But at the very basic level, I think legitimacy means something like laws and norms that can be accepted by those who find themselves governed by them, right? So either they can be accepted, or more practically, we should think that they are largely accepted. Not everybody will accept every law, or certainly not, and not everybody will even accept a legal system. But legitimacy in part must mean something like you can reasonably say to people that they are rightfully under these laws and norms. And what we're seeing in these police protests is the sustained anger and rage of a community, in particular African Americans, who have long said, in regards to us, policing has long been illegitimate. It has not been in our interest. It has not protected us. It has not been equal, just, or fair to us. And thus we can no longer, or perhaps we have never, viewed ourselves as fully able to consider it our police.
And so let's talk about some of the dimensions of the policing that have generated this crisis and legitimacy. It's certainly the extraordinary acts of violence that have been captured on video, but it's not limited to those, is it?
Not at all. In fact, you're exactly right. So, of course, these moments of spectacular violence are cruel and heartbreaking. And I'll tell you, for people of color in particular, they can just feel destabilizing. I mean, I remember when the Ahmaud Arbery video came out, I was having a wonderful evening with my family, and suddenly it was as though I'd been just thrown into the sky or something, just utterly distant and confused. So those moments are painful, but those are not the only moments. In fact, those are not at all the moments or the only moments that have caused this crisis of legitimacy. It's the moments of everyday domination and violence and inequity. It's the police officer who slams you against the hood of the car for no reason, who insults you and denigrates you, who communicates quite clearly to you that you're in their power. They can do what they want. It's the knowledge that your white neighbors smoke pot and it's sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or your classmates when you're going through school smoke pot and it was wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But if you were caught, you would start down a long road of records and misdemeanors and being labeled a thug that could easily derail your life. So those moments of everyday police domination are as much what this has been about as even the most painful, spectacular violence.
And now that experience is being perhaps revealed or better understood by many who are not directly experiencing that discrimination from the police.
Well, that's right. And, look, it is deeply gratifying to see the coalition of people who have taken to the streets to protest and to ask for fundamental change in policing. And indeed, we've long known it's impossible for policing to get better unless a coalition, in particular, unless white people who have a voice make it their project. But with that being said, one of the things that we have to look seriously in the eye is why it has taken so long for us to believe communities of color when they have, there is something bittersweet about complaining about a system of policing for literally hundreds of years, to have the iPhone come out, videotapes start being commonplace, showing the things that are being the most bitter, cruel things about the Black experience with policing since the history of the country, and then having your neighbor say, wow, how could we have known this was happening?
And at the same time, this perhaps creates a moment for some broader understanding, but is the concern that the broader understanding might stop where the video stops?
Well, that's right. So, I mean, as I said, I do think it is bittersweet, but nonetheless, this is a moment where enough people are starting to ask, why can't we fundamentally change these things? And one of the things that is going to be hugely important is that it not be something that is interesting so long as it's fashionable, that this translates into focused, thoughtful, years-long, systemic and fundamental change. And those things are possible. They've been done before. But if we allow this to be in the air only as long as a hashtag is popular, then, I don't need to be threatening when I say we will be here again.
I guess the question I'm asking, though, is it's important that there be a deeper understanding even than just you were telling the truth the whole time. It's a deeper understanding, not just of people's experiences, but a deeper understanding of the legitimacy question that needs to happen so that people can appreciate the nature of the change that has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, what people have to understand is when people say something is not legitimate, this is a serious issue. It sounds sometimes like it's fancy philosophical abstraction, but to understand that the police are not your police is to understand that you are outside the system and you are in some way in a low-level war with the system that's supposed to command your allegiance. And that is a position that is unsustainable for a country. It's unsustainable for a nation. What people need to understand, as I put in my writing, is legitimacy is the lifeblood of law. And if we cannot make it clear to our fellow citizens, in particular our fellow Black citizens, that the police are equally there to ensure that that the police are there to ensure that they are treated as equal citizens, that they will not bear any burden that a white community would not itself bear, then we are going to be in this low-level war.
Now, you have spoken and written quite a lot about the opioid epidemic and the different ways that race has factored into the responses to the opioid epidemic. Can you tell me a little bit about the lessons of the opioid epidemic and race for the discussion that we're having now about policing?
Well, absolutely. I think this ties into our points both about the nature of the reform that has to happen as well as the legitimacy point. So one way to think about it is many of the things that are on the table, for example, for the Black Lives Matter movement, things that are now considered radical, phrases that are sometimes purposely misconstrued when people say abolish the police. What people mean is huge swaths of problems cannot be dealt with as policing problems. Huge swaths of problems are social problems that need huge investment, resources, and social support. Now, what's one place where we saw that? Well, when the country was faced with a swath of addiction and death that it had never faced before, it was very obvious that you couldn't police your way out of this problem, right? We understood that we couldn't lock up all our brothers and sisters and mothers who'd become hooked on Oxycontin, that we were going to have rehabilitation programs that were ramped way up, that we were going to have to get doctors to stop prescribing at rates that were just at some point, for some of them, just pill mills, but even for well-meaning doctors, causing huge social damage, that we were going to have to talk about jobs programs and economic programs. In short, we decided that when it came to the opioid epidemic, we would, so to speak, abolish the police. Now, we can compare that, for example, with the same kinds of things that were asked for during the crack cocaine epidemic, where people said, we can't just lock up people. We can't just police our way out of these same problems. And
the mayor of Baltimore said that, and he got pilloried for it.
Pilloried. People were considered making excuses for Black pathology. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Why are these Negroes making excuses? What's wrong with them? Where are their fathers? You know, the same way in which we saw during the opioid epidemic that Rust Belt communities with no jobs, where young people feel hopeless, will fall into drug-induced despair. When the Black community asked for the same thing, it was considered denying responsibility, wishy-washy, and radical. And we're seeing the same kinds of things here, right? The things that protesters are asking for now that are being mocked as radical are the exact same things that we managed to see when the people in harm's way are white, that we can't just police our way out of these problems, that we need social programs to address the underlying harms, that we need to rebuild communities so that the police are not their first and only answer.
Right. The schools get the resources that they need, and other activities are well funded so that there's plenty of opportunities to engage young people with and give them hope for what they can do in their lives.
Absolutely. And we should notice that this is a long, long history, right? So, there was a time when Italian Americans were considered intolerable and unmanageable. There was a time when Slavs and Eastern Europeans were considered intolerable and unmanageable. And community organizers looked at their poor communities where there was too much crime and too much violence and said, let's invest. Let's build public parks, after-school programs, jobs programs. People understood that these things had to be attacked at their sources. And the problem we're seeing, the thing that is being protested, to put it shortly, is we can no longer have an America where white problems are social problems and Black problems are policing problems.
I think that is a very excellent way of kind of framing this. And I guess the question that will then come is whether we can make that shift, whether people will realize that this isn't just a question of particular police officers who some people, might call bad apples. You hear that phrase, but this really is about whether or not we're going to treat the challenges that exist as challenges that can really be addressed through all kinds of different ways, or just as issues of criminal justice.
No, that's exactly right. It seems to me, look, first of all, when we talk about bad apples, one of the things people have to realize is how much the law spends time protecting what we now think of as random or unfortunate policing. How, for example, the Supreme Court has said you can engage in pretextual stops. That has led to a generation of, as we call it, driving while Black crimes, right? Knowing that the police can pull you over at any time for any reason. And, I can tell you on a personal level, that is destabilizing. It is a destabilizing feeling to know that when you're on the road, you are simply at the behest of a police officer. And the Supreme Court has protected that. The Supreme Court, court after court, until recently, has ignored the huge racial disparity in things like stop and frisk. And so we can't just talk about a few bad apples. We have to talk about the way in which policing is allowed to be racially skewed. Now, a lot of people are talking, for example, about qualified immunity and the way in which police officers are protected from the results. And indeed, we could talk about police departments right? When police departments pay these settlements, it doesn't come out of their funds. It comes out of the city fund. But to your point, I'll conclude by saying this. Though I love my job and though thinking about criminal law means a great deal to me, I am deeply aware that by the time we're talking about criminal law, we are already talking about the back end of a great deal of damage, right? So one of the things we have to realize is how we can invest in programs that make communities healthy before we talk about sending in jump squads to arrest everybody.
I think that gets to the challenge because, let me just say, I think I appreciate that you're both a law professor and a philosopher, because I hear you saying that the crisis of legitimacy is supported by, unfortunately, the law in some many respects. And so you have a system that lacks legitimacy, that we see some signs of that have generated incredible protests, but it really requires rethinking how to create not just a legitimate police department, but a legitimate approach to African Americans and minority communities that have suffered from many different challenges.
I mean, look, I think one of the things that is disheartening every year in my criminal procedure class, criminal procedure is in law schools, the law of policing, is starting down the path of teaching them what the law ostensibly purports, and then whittling away at every turn and showing students how dedicated our courts are to being blind about race in policing, how the same kind of ways in which in ordinary conversation Americans shy away from tackling questions of racism, our courts have been utterly paralyzed in addressing questions of racism in policing. So, for example, courts have said it doesn't matter the subjective motivation of a police officer unless you can prove precisely that this police officer was being explicitly racist. Unless you can prove that, we're not going to touch policing. Their subjective motivations off the table. Same thing with juries. Same thing with the death penalty. It's not enough to show that the death penalty generally is racist. Unless you can show that this particular case, you were put to death for racist reasons. And so there's a way in which, when we talk about the crisis of legitimacy, even Black people who do not know the fine points of constitutional law are well aware that there's a system that has decided it doesn't care how much racism plays a role in policing.
Very interested in the implications of what's happening now for the field of public health. And partly what I hear you saying is that it is probably not just going to be, it certainly will need some legal, a bunch of different legal changes to improve policing. But that's not going to be enough, that we're going to have to bring the full weight of all of the different types of analyses, programs, and supports, and, together with communities in order to rethink the problems that are there and not see them as problems for the police in the first instance.
Well, I've learned a lot from you over the years. I've never heard a public health official, certainly not you, look at a particular widespread epidemiological or health problem and said, the best and only answer is to get people into a doctor when they're having a crisis heart attack, right? That would be an insane way of dealing with your public health system, one that we sometimes choose, but is nonetheless insane. It is clear that if you're seeing mass obesity, you address how people eat and exercise and where they live. If you're seeing poisoning, you address the poison in the air. And policing is exactly the same problem. What we're seeing people reject is the idea that what we need to do is hope that every surgeon, every police officer with a badge is perfectly trained, well-tempered, and sensible, though that is hugely important. We're also seeing, and it's been the core, for example, of the Black Lives Matter movement. a dedication to the question of how do we make these communities healthy before we ask the question of policing.
I just think that's such a great summation of the critical role the public health has to play at a moment like this, and it's a very important challenge. And I hope that we see the mobilization of public health in many ways right now, but that can be a sustained mobilization, like you were talking about, and sustained for the kinds of fundamental changes that will start to undo the racism that is at the heart of, our country's pain right now.
All I can say is there are times when I'm hugely dispirited and my head is down and exhausted. And, like too many of us, there are times when you're world weary and you wonder why bother. But then we remember that there were worlds before ours which had deeper scars and people who, died, marched, bled, voted to make it better. So, I try to remember that there are those who came before who endured worse. And so it must be our job to make it somewhat better for those who come after.
I couldn't agree more. And I can't thank you enough for joining us with this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Public Health on Call, a new podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Please send questions to be covered in future podcasts to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. This podcast is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Lamare Morales. Audio production by Niall Owen McCusker and Spencer Greer, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.